Hey everyone. So I wanted to go over how we would do this relative risk question that is labeled in Canvas as relative risk flu shot, I believe. So this question is set up and we're trying to see what's the relative risk of flu for those that did not receive a flu vaccine compared to those that did receive a vaccine. So we read our scenario up top. The first thing we need to do to construct this 2 by 2 table is just see what items we can fill into the table right off the bat. So we can see in the second sentence, using the state health plan records, he determined that 2/3 of the 990 faculty received a free flu vaccination in September. So we know that 990 is our total population. And then 2/3 of that 990 received a flu vaccine. So we're going to put that in the total number that received the vaccine. And so 2/3 of that 990 is going to give us 660. And so we can also then go ahead and fill out this total for those that were not vaccinated by subtracting the 660 from the 990. And that gives us 330. So if we continue reading, that according to these faculty responses, that there were 7 new flu cases among those who received a flu vaccination shot. So out of these people that received this flu vaccine, there were 7 cases. And 6 new cases among those who did not receive a flu vaccination. So that's going to be these. So 6 people that did not receive a vaccine reported having the flu. And so now we can just fill in the rest of our table. So we now know that the total of new flu cases would be 13 by adding the 7 to the 6. And we can fill in the rest of the table here by doing our subtraction. So 660 minus 7 is going to give us 653 people that did not have the flu in the vaccination group, and subtracting the 6 from the 330 gives us 324, and then we can add those two numbers up. That's going to give us 977. And so we can also run a check. So the 977 plus the 13 should also equal 990. And we see that it does. So we now have our table set up and we can answer the rest of the questions. So item B asks, what's the incidence of flu per 1,000 faculty among those who received a flu vaccination shot? So our formula for incidence, the total number of new cases over the total population that was at risk. And so for this item, the population is those who received a flu vaccine. And so calculating out the incidence, the total number of new cases within that population is 7. And the total population that was at risk would be that 660. So we're only worried about those that received a flu vaccine. And so if we calculate that out, 7 divided by the 660 equals 0.01061, and we want it per 1,000. So I'm going to multiply it by 1,000. And that gives me 10.61 per 1,000. Now remember, this is an incidence rate, so we want to include the time period. And so if we read our scenario, we can see that the time period we were interested in was if anyone had the flu between October 1st to March 31st, which is a time period of 6 months. Okay, so item C now is asking about the relative risk. So what is the relative risk of contracting the flu among those not getting the flu shot compared to those getting the flu shot? So the relative risk is just taking the incidence rates, which we've had a lot of experience calculating out incidence rates, and then we're just going to compare those two incidence rates. So the formula for relative risk, the risk or the incidence in the exposed group over the risk or the incidence in the non-exposed group. So for this particular question, the exposed group would be those that did not receive the flu vaccine, and the non-exposed would be those that did receive the vaccine. So if you're a little confused on the exposed versus non-exposed, just remember we're comparing two groups. You can just think of it as comparing the incidence rates of Group A versus the incidence in Group B. So for this item, we're looking at the relative risk of contracting flu among those not getting the flu shot. So what is the incidence of flu in those not getting the flu shot? And we get that by calculating out 6 divided by 330. And then we're comparing it to the incidence of flu in those that did receive a vaccine. So that's going to be what we calculated up above in item B, which would be the 7 divided by the 660. And so let's calculate that out. 6 divided by 330 gives us 0.01818, and then we can divide that by the 7 divided by 660, which we've already calculated out, so the 0.01061. And so once we calculate that out, we get a relative risk of 1.71. Okay? And so this is the relative risk. It's a ratio, so we're not going to put in per 1,000 or time period. That's not how we interpret the relative risk. It's just the ratio of one risk to another risk. So we would say that the relative risk is 1.71. So now it's asking us to describe what that relative risk that we've just calculated means. And so it's 1.7, which means the risk in our first group, the risk in the exposed group, is greater than the risk in our second group, or our non-exposed group. So in this case, the risk of getting the flu is greater in those that did not receive the flu vaccine than those that did get the flu vaccine. And that relative risk tells us how much riskier it is to not receive the vaccine. So the higher the relative risk, the more risky it is to be in that group. And so we would interpret that 1.71 as those who did not receive a flu vaccine are 1.71 times more likely to have the flu than those who did receive a vaccine. Okay? So that is one way that you can say it. You can also say that the risk is 1.7 times more than those who did receive a vaccine. Or we could calculate out that percent change doing the 1.71 minus the 1 times 100 to give us a 70% increased risk. So that's how you do relative risk. So hopefully this helps you out. And let me know if you have any questions.